A woman from a wealthy family was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, but even some of the best doctors in the city could not figure out what was wrong with her. Eventually, police became involved, and what they uncovered stunned everyone connected to the case. With every new twist, the story began to feel less like real life and more like the plot of a detective novel, while its final outcome drew attention from people across the country. Nancy Lyon was born on August 6, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. She was the youngest of 4 children, with 2 older brothers and a sister. Her father had built a successful career in commercial real estate, so the family was very well off. They lived in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in Dallas, were actively involved in charity, and were highly respected in the community. Growing up, Nancy was quiet and somewhat shy, but she was also an excellent student with ambitious plans for her future. After finishing high school, she attended Hollins College in Roanoke, Virginia, and received a liberal arts degree in 1975. She later chose to specialize in landscape architecture, spending 2 years at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Fine Arts, before moving on to the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where she completed the program in 1981. During her first year at Harvard, Nancy met a man named Richard, and the two began dating. After graduation, they got married and moved back to Dallas, settling near the same upscale neighborhood where Nancy's parents lived. Nancy went to work for one of the largest construction companies in the country at the time, where she quickly began moving up the ranks. She earned a reputation as a talented leader and eventually became the youngest partner in the company's history. 5 years into their marriage, Nancy and Richard welcomed their first daughter, followed by a second 2 years later. By the age of 37, Nancy had built a successful career and a family of her own. It seemed like she had everything she could have dreamed of, or at least, that was how it looked from the outside. But then one day, everything changed. On the evening of January 8, 1991, Nancy suddenly became extremely ill. She was suffering from severe stomach pain, and her condition continued to get worse. Richard contacted her doctor, who suspected food poisoning and recommended a medication. He went to the pharmacy, brought it home, and gave it to Nancy, but it didn't help. Richard then took her to the hospital, where she was admitted for further testing. Doctors ran a series of tests, but none of them revealed what was wrong, even as Nancy's condition deteriorated by the hour. Her breathing became erratic. Blood pressure dropped to dangerously low levels, and the following morning, her organs had begun to fail. By then, doctors had begun to suspect that Nancy might have been exposed to some kind of poison, so they ordered additional tests. But her condition was deteriorating too quickly for them to determine the cause in time. Several of her organs began to fail. She lost the ability to breathe on her own and eventually slipped into a coma. The doctors continued doing everything they could to save her, but it soon became clear that she had no chance of recovering. Her family was told that they would have to make the difficult decision to remove her from life support. 6 days after she was admitted to the hospital, Nancy died. Because doctors had been unable to determine what caused her death, her body had been sent to the Dallas County Medical Examiner's office for an autopsy. But there was another reason as well. By that point, they were seriously considering the possibility that Nancy had been deliberately poisoned. While she was still conscious, Nancy had told one of the doctors that she believed someone might be poisoning her. According to Nancy, the strange incidents had begun about 4 months earlier, when she found a bottle of expensive wine and an unsigned card on her front porch. Assuming it was a gift from the neighbors, she poured herself a glass and took a few sips. The wine tasted terrible, so she assumed it had gone bad. Later that evening, she developed severe stomach pain. Although at the time, it had never crossed her mind that someone might have tried to poison her. Looking back, however, Nancy remembered that something about the bottle had seemed unusual. It looked as though it might have already been opened. Her symptoms eventually went away, but not long afterward, 2 things happened that made Nancy begin to wonder whether someone was deliberately making her sick, and whether her own husband might be behind it. Back in 1989, several years before Nancy's death, she had discovered that Richard was having an affair. She found bank statements showing that he had been spending large amounts of money on gifts for another woman and on trips they had taken together. Richard initially denied everything, but eventually admitted to the affair. He and Nancy decided to try to save their marriage for the sake of their daughters, and Richard swore he had ended the affair. About a year later, however, Nancy learned that Richard had spent several days away with the same woman, and at that point, she decided their marriage was over. She told Richard to move out and hired an attorney named Mary to begin discussing the details of a divorce. Nancy also restricted Richard's access to their joint accounts because he was continuing to spend large amounts of money on his mistress. Nancy earned considerably more than Richard did, so she was the main source of the family's income. Without access to their shared money, he would not have been able to maintain that kind of spending on his own salary. In September of 1990, Nancy told Richard that she had made a final decision to go through with the divorce. He initially accepted it, but over the next several weeks, the two began discussing whether they should make one last attempt to save their marriage for the sake of their children. They started marriage counseling and gradually began spending more time together. Nancy and Richard went on dates and even traveled out of state with their daughters to visit relatives. By the end of 1990, Richard had moved back into Nancy's home, and the couple ultimately decided not to divorce. They withdrew the paperwork in early January, just a few days before Nancy was hospitalized. By then, however, Nancy had already begun to suspect that Richard might be trying to poison her. She was far from certain and did not want to believe that her husband could be capable of something like that. But one particular incident had made her consider that possibility. It happened after Nancy found the bottle of wine on her porch. Several weeks later, she and Richard went out on a date together as part of their effort to repair the marriage. They had dinner at a restaurant and then went to a movie. At the theater, Richard brought Nancy a cup of soda, but as soon as she took a sip, she noticed a strange taste. When she looked inside the cup, she saw what appeared to be some kind of white powder in her drink. Nancy pointed it out to Richard, but he insisted that nothing was wrong with it and repeatedly tried to convince her to keep drinking. And when she refused, he became visibly angry. Later that night, Nancy became extremely ill once again. It was the first time she seriously wondered whether Richard might have put something dangerous in her drink. After Richard moved back into the house, Nancy continued experiencing similar episodes, and they gradually became more and more frequent. She went to several doctors and underwent numerous tests, but no one could determine what was causing her symptoms. Around the same time, Richard began giving her what he described as vitamins, insisting that they would help improve her health. Nancy, however, never saw the bottle or the packaging the capsules had come from. On another evening, while Nancy was already feeling unwell, Richard brought a drink to her bedside. She took several sips, and in the middle of the night, she became violently ill again. Mary advised her to bring in the bottle of wine and the vitamin capsules so they could be sent to a laboratory for testing, but Nancy was reluctant to do so. She told Mary that she did not want to accuse her husband of trying to poison her, especially without proof. A scandal like that would have been deeply embarrassing to her family, and Nancy had been raised to believe that protecting the family's reputation was extremely important. Still, she had kept both the wine bottle and the capsules, and she told Mary where to find them. As soon as Mary learned that Nancy had been hospitalized and that the doctors could not explain her condition, she called Nancy's father and told him everything. Nancy was still alive at the time. Her father immediately went to the hospital and asked the doctors to test her for poison. He also brought them the wine bottle and the capsules, which were then sent to a laboratory for analysis. At that time, the doctors had already submitted samples of Nancy's blood for toxicology testing because she had told them the same story she had previously shared with her attorney. But tests like these took time, and Nancy's condition was deteriorating far too quickly, so none of the results came back before she passed away. After Nancy died, 2 separate reports were made to the police. One came from her family after they learned what she had told her attorney. The other came from the doctor Nancy had spoken to about her fears of being poisoned just hours before she slipped into a coma. The medical examiner performed an autopsy but could not find any natural reason for Nancy's organs to have failed. As far as he could tell, she had not been suffering from any illness or medical condition that could explain her death, so he would have to wait for the toxicology results to learn more. In the meantime, experts examined the bottle of wine and the vitamin capsules Nancy's family had brought to the hospital. No poison was found in the wine, but the capsules told a very different story. 2 of them contained barium carbonate, a toxic chemical used for industrial purposes and never meant to be consumed. It could have explained Nancy's symptoms, but when Nancy's toxicology results came back, they revealed something else entirely. The poison in her system was arsenic, not barium carbonate. The concentration in her blood was many times higher than normal, and the medical examiner concluded that arsenic poisoning had damaged her organs and ultimately caused her death. This left investigators with a confusing situation. Nancy had almost certainly been poisoned, but apparently not with the same toxic substance found inside the capsules she had been taking. Once investigators received the results, they began trying to determine when and how Nancy had been given the fatal amount of arsenic. Nancy had been getting sick on and off for nearly 4 months before her death, including several particularly severe episodes, which led investigators to believe that someone may have been poisoning her repeatedly throughout that time. To see whether that was the case, they asked a chemistry professor to examine strands of Nancy's hair for traces of arsenic. The idea behind the testing was pretty simple. Hair grows outward from the root, so the farther a section was from Nancy's scalp, the earlier period of her life it represented. Because traces of arsenic could remain in the hair, the professor could estimate roughly when the poison had entered her body. In the end, he identified at least 3 separate exposures. The earliest had occurred about 2.5 months before Nancy's death, while the most recent, and the one that left the highest concentration of arsenic in her hair, appeared to have taken place roughly 2 weeks before she died. Even that final dose was not enough to kill her immediately, though, but over the following days, the poison gradually damaged her internal organs until they began to fail. By the time all of these tests were completed, several weeks had already passed since Nancy's death. Based on what she had told her doctor and attorney, nearly everyone close to her suspected that Richard had killed her. The police, however, were careful not to publicly identify him as a suspect and asked Nancy's family not to let him know that he was under investigation. Detectives did not question Richard until about a month and a half after Nancy's death. To their surprise, they learned that he had only recently returned from a vacation in Mexico with his mistress, a trip the two had taken shortly after Nancy's funeral. Richard was asked to come to the police station, but at first, investigators did not tell him that Nancy's death had been linked to poisoning. At that point, the toxicology findings had been kept secret even from most of her family, so the detectives began with more general questions. They asked Richard whether there were any chemicals around the house that Nancy could have been exposed to. He mentioned some ant and weed killers stored in the garage, but claimed that none of them were harmful to people. As the conversation continued, however, Richard suddenly remembered that he had ordered several chemicals the previous summer, including arsenic and cyanide. According to him, he had purchased them to deal with a stubborn colony of fire ants in the yard. Richard claimed that he never ended up using all of the chemicals and eventually threw them away. The detectives then asked permission to search his house and car without a warrant, and Richard agreed. They found no arsenic or other dangerous poisons, aside from a relatively mild ant control product. Investigators also spoke with the neighbors, who confirmed that the property really had been dealing with a serious fire ant problem in the backyard. Even so, the detectives only became more suspicious of Richard and began looking closely at his financial records. They discovered that he had placed at least 3 orders with a chemical supply company. In January 1990, about a year before Nancy's death, he ordered lithium hydroxide. Then, in August, he purchased a long list of chemicals, including the same barium carbonate later found inside the capsules Nancy had been taking. And finally, in late November, Richard ordered large quantities of several different arsenic compounds, spending nearly $300. Some of the packages had been delivered to his workplace. The August shipment, however, had been sent to the apartment where Richard lived after moving out of Nancy's home while the two were preparing for divorce. Detectives went to the building and spoke with one of Richard's neighbors. The man said Richard had asked him to accept several deliveries because he would not be home when they arrived. The neighbor had no idea what was inside the packages, but he remembered seeing warnings about hazardous chemicals on the box. Investigators then asked the landlord for permission to search the apartment Richard had previously rented. Inside, they found a bag of empty capsules that could be opened and filled by hand, along with a bottle of vitamins. All of this looked extremely damaging for Richard, but investigators still did not have enough evidence to arrest him. So, they finally decided to make the investigation public, hoping that someone might come forward with additional information. In mid-March, roughly 3 months after Nancy's death, police held a press conference and announced that they were treating the case as a homicide, and they also publicly identified Richard as a possible suspect. The case immediately became a major news story. Nancy came from a wealthy, well-known Dallas family, and the idea that a successful woman might have been poisoned in her own home, possibly by her husband, quickly captured the public's attention. The very next day, Richard and his attorney held a press conference of their own. Richard denied having anything to do with his wife's death and continued to insist that he had purchased the chemicals solely to deal with insects. He also offered several alternative explanations for what might have happened, each of which raised a new set of questions. First, Richard said that Nancy had been scheduled to testify in a case against one of her former bosses, who was accused of stealing a large sum of money. After Nancy's involvement became known, she and one of her coworkers received anonymous letters warning them to stay out of the case. The coworker later told detectives that Nancy had been very nervous about testifying and deeply shaken by the threats. Investigators looked into this possibility and questioned Nancy's former boss. He denied sending the threats and claimed that he had not even known the letters existed. He also pointed out that the lawsuit had eventually been resolved through an agreement between both sides, so he would have had no reason to kill any of the witnesses. That did not completely rule him out, but detectives could not find anything linking him to Nancy's death. Richard's second theory was even more bizarre. He suggested Nancy might have been taking small amounts of arsenic on her own to make herself sick, hoping to gain his sympathy and convince him to return to the marriage. According to Richard, she may have accidentally taken too much. Finally, Richard suggested that Nancy's older brother, Bill, might have been responsible for her death. Richard claimed that Nancy had once told him about something deeply inappropriate Bill had done to her years earlier. To back up his story, he gave police a collection of notes Nancy had written after her therapy sessions. The notes read almost like a personal journal, and detectives quickly noticed that many of the entries focused on Bill. In the notes, Nancy said that Bill had put her through terrible things for years, and that she was still afraid he might hurt her to keep her from telling anyone what had happened. She also wrote that his drinking and aggressive behavior had been getting worse, leaving her worried not only for herself, but for her daughters as well. According to Nancy, Bill was also jealous of her successful career and owed her nearly $90,000 from money he had borrowed over the years. Detectives went to speak with Nancy's parents, and, to their surprise, they admitted that some kind of inappropriate incident had occurred between Nancy and Bill many years earlier. They insisted, however, that it had not been nearly as serious as Nancy described in her notes. Bill denied everything and called Nancy's account completely false, leaving detectives to figure out whether there was any way to verify what she had written. Then, while the investigation was still underway, police received an anonymous letter from someone claiming to be a hired killer. The writer said that Bill had paid him to kill Nancy, but after Bill failed to hand over the promised money, he decided to tell police everything. Detectives tried to track down who had sent the letter, but there was nothing in it that could lead them to the writer. It had also been typed, so there was no handwriting to analyze, and the lead quickly went nowhere. After that, investigators decided to send Nancy's notes to a handwriting expert to confirm who had written the passages about Bill. At first, the expert found that all of the entries appeared to have been written in the same handwriting, including the many pages that had nothing to do with Nancy's brother. But when he compared them with other samples from both Nancy and Richard, he discovered something unusual. Their handwriting was almost identical. According to Nancy's family, this was not a coincidence. The two had deliberately learned to write alike when they were in college, because Nancy sometimes completed important assignments for Richard, and they did not want anyone to realize that someone else had written them. After studying the individual letters more closely, the expert found several small but consistent differences that allowed them to tell Nancy's handwriting from Richard's. He concluded that Nancy had written most of the notes, but every passage about Bill had been added by Richard. That finding gave prosecutors what they believed was the final piece they needed, and 5 months after Nancy's death, Richard was arrested. According to the prosecution, he had deliberately poisoned his wife with several different chemicals while trying to make her death look like the result of a mysterious illness. Rather than giving her one immediate fatal dose, he allegedly exposed her to smaller amounts over several months, creating a history of unexplained health problems and leading the people around her to believe that she was seriously ill. When it came to the motive, prosecutors believed it was something all too common in cases like this: money. According to prosecutors, money was at the center of Richard's plan. Nancy earned far more than he did, while his own financial situation was already a mess. If they divorced, he would lose the comfortable lifestyle her income provided, and would likely have to pay child support for their 2 daughters. At the same time, Richard apparently wanted to leave Nancy and start a new life with his mistress. The problem was that after a divorce, he would not have been able to offer her anything close to the lifestyle he enjoyed while married to Nancy. That was why prosecutors believed his sudden interest in saving the marriage had never been genuine. By convincing Nancy to stop the divorce and let him move back home, Richard could remain in line to inherit her savings and collect the $500,000 payout from her life insurance policy. More importantly, living with her again gave him the access he needed to keep slipping chemicals into the things she consumed. Richard's mistress continued to stand by him, but several details in her story ended up making him look even more suspicious. She told investigators that Richard had claimed Nancy was suffering from a rare blood disorder and probably did not have long to live. In reality, Nancy had never been diagnosed with anything like that, and Richard had made the comment months before she first became seriously ill. He had also promised his mistress that he would eventually marry her, and their relationship continued in secret even after he moved back in with Nancy and supposedly began trying to save his marriage. The defense returned to the same 3 theories Richard had already shared at his press conference: that Nancy had been killed either by Bill or by her former boss, or that she may have been taking small amounts of arsenic on her own in an attempt to win Richard back. To support the final theory, Richard's attorneys presented what initially appeared to be a significant piece of evidence. Richard claimed that he had found an invoice among Nancy's belongings showing that she had purchased several chemicals, including arsenic. The document even appeared to carry Nancy's signature, making it look as though she had personally placed the order. But the story quickly fell apart when the owner of the company listed on the invoice took the stand. He explained that his business had never sold any of the chemicals named on it, and that their invoices were always written out by hand on completely different forms, not typed like the one Richard claimed to have found. In other words, there was no chance the invoice was real. And instead of helping Richard's defense, it only gave prosecutors another reason to believe he had tried to frame Nancy. Even so, the defense made one more attempt to convince the jury that Nancy might have poisoned herself. They called a psychiatrist who had never met Nancy at any point in her life. Based solely on conversations with Richard and newspaper coverage of the case, he concluded that Nancy may have suffered from psychological problems and could have knowingly taken poison in an effort to bring her husband back. But the prosecution had a much stronger response to that theory. When Nancy was admitted to the hospital and told a doctor that she believed she had been poisoned, she also begged him not to let her die. If Nancy had knowingly taken arsenic, it made little sense that she would plead for doctors to save her while refusing to tell them what she had taken. Simply naming the poison could have allowed them to begin the appropriate treatment immediately and given her at least some chance of survival. In the end, the jury did not find any of the defense's theories convincing, and Richard was found guilty of murdering Nancy. The judge later sentenced him to life in prison and imposed a $10,000 fine. In the years that followed, Richard repeatedly tried to have his conviction overturned. Richard first tried to overturn his conviction by arguing that the case against him was entirely circumstantial. When that went nowhere, he blamed his attorney for mishandling the trial and demanded a new one. But in 1994, an appeals court ruled that the evidence against Richard was overwhelming, effectively ending his chances of getting the conviction overturned. Over the next several decades, Richard continued to insist that he was innocent. He eventually reached out to several organizations that investigate wrongful convictions, but none of them agreed to take his case. Even so, he managed to attract a small group of supporters who created a website laying out their arguments for why they believed he had been wrongly convicted. As for Nancy and Richard's daughters, they had effectively lost both of their parents, and after Richard's arrest, they were taken in by Nancy's family. It later came out that once Nancy began to suspect Richard was poisoning her, she had quietly changed the beneficiary on her life insurance policy. The $500,000 payout would now go directly to her daughters instead of Richard, meaning that even if he had never been convicted, he would still not have received the money. As of today, Richard remains in prison. He first became eligible for parole in 2006, but the board denied his request, partly because he continued to deny any responsibility for Nancy's death. He tried again 10 years later, only to receive the same answer. His most recent attempt came in the spring of 2026, but once again, the parole board refused to release him, despite the fact he is now close to 70 years old. At this point, there is a very real chance that Richard will never be released, and will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like if you appreciated the video. Thanks for watching.